And thank you all for coming along. It's really good, really great to see you. Thank you. It's nice to be here in person as well too, because we have had a couple of false starts over the last couple of years. It's lovely to see so many people in the library. And I spoke to a couple of people I know who have read some of my books. If you've read any of my books, I'd love to have a chat to you after the talk. And if you haven't read any of my books, I'd especially love to have a chat to you after the talk. But it has been a great response. Thanks very much to the Cairns Libraries for bringing me up here. I really appreciate it. And I've just come back from South Africa the week before, and the week before last. And I've just been travelling around South Africa. I had another book, a non-fiction book, came over there about the fight to protect rhinos. And so I was travelling promoting that. But most of the promotional tours that I do in South Africa are in bookstores. And the reason for that is they don't have the same well-resourced public library network that we have here in Australia. And it's a nice reminder for me to come back here, because I think I can be at risk of taking things for granted in our country in Australia, because one of the great strengths when it comes to the book industry and the reading world and the reading public that we have in this country is our well-resourced network of public libraries. And we must never forget how important they are. And I think the fact that you're all here today is a testament to that. So thank you for coming along. And if you live local and you're not a member of the local library, I'd certainly encourage you to join, because it's a fantastic resource that we have here. So thanks a lot for me being here. I think there's a couple of people that have seen me talk before. I know there's a friend of mine in the audience, Frank Coates, another author who also was writing novels set in Africa. I think Frank spends more time on the golf course these days than he does behind the computer, but I encourage you to look for Frank's books as well. Set in Africa, but a little bit different to mine. Frank's books tend to be set in East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. When Frank was putting one out a year like I was, we had what was called the Mason-Dixon line in Africa, where I would stick south and he would stick up to the north and east of the country. I'll talk a little bit about how it is that an Aussie comes to be writing books set in Africa later on, but it was interesting for me to get back on the road and come to libraries and meet booksellers again, because I thought I'd just talk a little bit about some of the trials and tribulations of an author's life, travelling around and doing events such as this, because it's so great to see so many people here today. It's really encouraging. It's not always like that. When I was first published, my publisher sat me down and gave me what I think is the New Author Talk 101. 3 rules. She says, number 1, she says, you should be pathetically grateful that we've published you. She says, they get thousands of manuscripts and people wanting to write books. And not everybody can get published. So you should be very thankful that I said, yes, I'm very, very thankful for you. Second thing she said to me was, don't expect to make any money out of it. It's a fact that unfortunately, only about 10% of published authors in Australia make enough money to be able to live off their writing. I think if you're lucky and you write the #1 bestseller and sell 1 million copies or so, then you've done well and you can make a lot of money. But I sometimes feel for those authors that have that initial big blockbuster novel, because then they must be under intense pressure to deliver something as good next time around. And then there's people like me who are kind of somewhere in the middle and just write a lot of books. As you heard from Marina, this is my 20th novel, but I also write non-fiction. So I've written about 8 non-fiction books as well. And it was probably not until I had about 10 novels under my belt and had started delving into a bit of non-fiction, where I would write a novel every year and then a non-fiction book, that I probably started earning enough to be able to live on it. But I am extremely grateful to be in that position, because this is the one thing in life that I wanted to do from the time I was a little kid. If ever some adult when I was a little kid asked me what I wanted to do in life, I would say, I want to write a book. To which they'd say, yes, very good. Why don't you become a plumber? I wish I had sometimes, or electrician. I've got 3 Land Rovers in Africa. I wish I was a diesel mechanic. Anyway, but this is what I wanted to do. And the third thing my publisher said to me, now don't expect to be going out to any libraries or bookstores and doing any talks, because no one will come. So I thought, okay, fair enough. I mean, I think as Marina might have mentioned, I worked in the media and I worked in public relations. I took on board the first 2 rules, but I thought, I can organise. I thought if anyone can organise a book talk, I can organise a book talk. I was working in public relations at the time. Funnily enough, a lady that I'd met through work had just bought into a bookstore, into a franchise, into a store in Sydney. And she said, oh, you've just written a book. And I said, yes, you've just bought a bookstore. She said, we should have a book event. We should have a book launch at the shop. I said, yeah, what a great idea. She says, well, okay, we'll do a bit of promotion. We'll put some posters up in the shop and we'll get something in the local media. And I said, I'll help out with the media and we'll just spread the word as far and wide as we can. And we did, and we had a launch in the shop. And that night, 3 people showed up, which would have been good given some of my subsequent appearances, except I was related to all of them. So I think it was a bit of a technical zero. So I put those grand plans of going out and promoting myself and coming to libraries and seeing good people like yourselves on hold. And it wasn't until I'd done 4 books, I think, my book Safari, that someone had a copy of, one of the old ones, came out that something happened. I was in South Africa because, to sort of give you a little bit of background, if you're not aware of my background, I'm not from South Africa, I'm not from Zimbabwe or any of the countries I'm from. I'm often asked if I was born there or if my wife's from there. She's not, she's an Aussie. We just happened to visit Africa, and as I'll probably talk a little bit later on, got hooked and ended up writing books set in Africa. We were back in Africa because by the time my first book came out in 2004, a book called Far Horizon came out, by that stage our addiction had grown to the extent that we were spending half of our lives in Africa, literally every year. 6 months, we were both doing contract work. I was doing freelance writing and PR. My wife was working in IT, and we would spend 6 months of our lives in Africa. We'd work very hard for 6 months in Australia, hard as we possibly could. We'd go back to Africa. I would write another book and we'd blow all our money. We'd come back to Australia. I'd ask Mum for $1,000 to pay the mortgage as a loan and pay her back, and then get back into work and do it all over again. So I was in South Africa and I got an email from Darwin City Libraries, and they said, Mr. Park, would you like to come to Darwin, talk at the libraries? We're trying to get authors to come up. We'll pay for your airfare, we'll pay for your accommodation. I thought, this sounds pretty good. I thought, this sounds like a good little number. And so I said, yeah, I'd love to come. And they were so grateful. And I ended up talking to the librarian on the phone. She said, we're so happy that you could come. We're struggling to get authors to come up there. I think it's a lot better now. I said, oh, okay. I said, so did you just work your way through the alphabet of Australian authors until you got for P for Park and somebody said yes? She said, yeah, pretty much. I said, well, I'm happy to go up there. So when I came back to Australia, I flew up there because this new book, Safari, was coming out to promote it. Now, I'd never really done this before. This was still very new territory for me, but I thought it's pretty good, you know. So I got up there and the plane came in at some ridiculous hour. It was like midnight or something like that. And so I got off the plane, came through the airport terminal, and I thought, well, what do I do? You know, I've got a hotel in town. I thought, I'll just go out and I'll get a cab. So I got a cab. And I went into town, into the hotel, and the first library talk was going to be the next morning at the City Library, about 10:30 in the morning, this sort of time. So I walked from the hotel, got there a bit early, about 10:10. The librarian was so grateful. She says, oh my goodness, you're here. She said, we didn't know where you were. And I said, yeah, I flew in last night. She says, I was waiting at the airport for you. I said, well, I didn't know. She says, you look nothing like the picture on your book. It was a few years ago, all right? Had a little bit more hair and stuff like that. Says, you're taller than I thought you were going to be. They don't call those pictures vanity pictures for nothing. Anyway, but we were there and it was good, and it was a good turnout. I think they had about 15, 20 people. They were very happy with that. A few mums and bubs had come for story time and they sat in, and it was a good event, you know. And I spruiked my new book, and you know, and it was great. And so they were feeling quite good. They said the next event is going to be in the evening at Casuarina, just outside of Darwin, one of the suburbs. They said, we're not really sure how many people are going to show up, you know, it's sort of still early days, and so I think they were trying to manage my expectations. And so we showed up there in the evening, and there was 100 people there. It was amazing, it was incredible, and it was a really good night, really good feedback. And the librarians were absolutely over the moon. They were so happy that it was going so well. And they said, tomorrow it's going to be even better. They said, we're going to Palmerston, which is this new town outside of Darwin, and I think grew up as a lot of the Australian Army moved up there. She's a big army base. You were in the army, they'll love you. And so, yeah, this will be good. So they had really high hopes. So that was going to be an evening event. So the next morning, we showed up to Palmerston about 5:45 or 5:30, 5:45 for a 6 o'clock start. They'd already opened a few bottles of wine, had the cheese and bickies and the nibblies out, everything ready to go for the crowd that was going to arrive. And 2 people showed up, I think 3 people showed up, and one of them, she had all my books up to date, all 4 books or whatever there was back then. And so I quickly signed them. I thought, we'll beat the rush. And then no one else showed up. So it's me and these 3 people who'd taken the time out to go. I thought, well, I can't stand in front of them and give a talk like I can to a nice big crowd like this, so we'll just sit around and have a chat, have a glass of wine and a couple of nibbles. At 10 o'clock, one of the local councillors drove past and said, why are the lights still on in the library? Came in, what's going on here? Said, oh, I'm Tony Park, I'm doing a book talk here or whatever with my readers. He says, I think I'll join you. So we finished up about 12 o'clock, midnight that night. It's one of the best library talks I've ever done. It was fantastic. So in short, if someone could be bothered coming to see me, then I would love to have a chat to them, and I'd certainly like to have a chat to people afterwards. I had another funny thing that happened to me. My mum, until a couple of years ago, was running a bed and breakfast in Mudgee in New South Wales. And if you ever happened to walk into my mum's B&B to stay there, you could be forgiven for thinking I was dead. There were pictures of me from a baby to an adult everywhere on all the walls, little shrines with memorabilia of a nice selection of books there, all of the books in fact, 2-for-1 offers, posters down the hallway as you go to the room of book covers. When you got into your room, you know that plastic folder you get with all the info, the pizza joints and the emergency numbers? No. Book reviews, more deals. I've met a lot of readers over the years who were introduced to my books through my mum. Anyway, so I went up there one Christmas when another one of my books, African Dawn, had come out. And it was no surprise if you're a friend of my mum what you get for a Christmas present. So a signed Tony Park book, whether you want it or not. Anyway, so she says, I need a few books. And my stepdad was usually in charge of buying the books. They had a local bookstore. Unfortunately, it closed down. So we used to have to go down to the local big discount store. I won't say which one it is down there, but to go and buy the stock. And they always had quite a bit on hand, but she was running short. So she said, I need about 7 copies for presents. I said, it's okay, I'll go into town and I'll get them, because they were getting Christmas dinner ready. It was Christmas Eve. And so I went into town, I went into the big store, and I went to the book aisle, and it was busy, you know, because Christmas Eve, last minute shopping. I didn't want to cause a ruckus or anything, or say who I was or anything. I walked down the aisle, and there was 2 copies of this book of mine, African Dawn, but I need 7. So I found a shop assistant. I said, have you got any more of these? And she says, oh, I'm not sure, you know, I have to ask a supervisor. I thought, well, that'd be great, you know. So she goes and finds this supervisor who's stressed, you know, and busy. And I said, have you got any more of these books by this Tony Park fella, you know? And she goes, oh, I'll have to have a look on the computer. So she checks, and there's a box of 10 somewhere, you know. So we're walking up and down the aisles and looking at the shelves where all the bulk boxes of books are. And she's going, Tony Park, Tony Park, Tony Park. She turns and looks at me, and I'm like, she says, you're his dad. I said, he's that other old bald bloke. Anyway, nice lesson in humility. So anyway, but it's great to be here, and it's good to be having another book here. How did I end up writing books in Africa? I don't know. As I said before, the only thing in life that I knew I wanted to do was write a novel. I didn't know what I wanted to write about. I think, in fact, there was one other thing I wanted to do. My mum got me reading very early on when I was little. And although I don't have kids of my own, I firmly believe that the best gift that a parent or a grandparent can give to a child is a love of reading. If I want to annoy my nephews or my friends' kids, I buy them book vouchers. Because I think encouraging a love of reading is a great gift to give to a child. My mum was a big reader, and she got me reading early on. And I think she had me wired because she got me reading Biggles books. Does anyone remember Biggles? Yeah, about the aviator from the first, all of them, every single one. So I think when I was growing up, I not only wanted to be an author, I think I wanted to be Captain W.E. Johns, the author of the Biggles book, an author / fighter pilot, because I thought I'd like to be a pilot as well, maybe in the Air Force or a chopper pilot in the Army. But unfortunately, as I got older and started going to school, I learned that you have to be able to do maths and physics to be a pilot. Well, there was no way I was going to be a pilot. About the only thing I was any good at was English, so which was fortunate because the only thing I wanted to do was write a book. And I ended up working as a journo after school. I had a couple of years at uni, I dropped out of that. But I got a job as a journalist working on local papers around Sydney. And I loved it. I loved writing. I wasn't a very good reporter. I wasn't an investigative, foot in the door sort of person. I was never going to make it onto 60 Minutes or TV or anything like that. But I like writing, and I thought maybe I'm on the right track. But, you know, life moves along. I met a girl, got married, got a mortgage, whatever. But I still had this desire, so I tried. I had a couple of false starts. I would try and get up early in the morning and try and start writing a novel. But all too soon I had to get on the bus and go to work. Or I would try and write after work. But it was really hard. It was really hard to focus. And I know we've got at least one other author here and Frank as well too. But I don't know about anybody else who's maybe thought about writing a book, but it seemed to me that there was two really big obstacles to writing a book. And I should mention that my friend Tammy Matson is up the back there as well, who's also written a couple of books as well. But there was two big obstacles for me for writing. And they came down to time, because it takes a bit of time to write one of these. There's 120,000 words or so in one of these. And even though I'm considered to be quite, you know, fast working as a writer, and I do a book a year, it's still about 6 months worth of work. And place. Funnily enough, one of the hardest things for me was to work out where to set my book that I wanted to write. It was really hard for me to focus on a particular place, a particular time. I like reading thrillers. I like reading a bit of historical stuff. Perhaps because of my background in the military, I like a bit of military fiction, historical fiction. I could write a book in the past. I could write a book in the present. If you're into sci-fi and fantasy and that, you could write a book in the future or in a completely different world to ours. And for me, I just needed to sort of zero in and think about where I was going to set my book. I was into my 30s. And I thought I can at least tackle one of these things. So I went to my wife, and at the time I had a good job. I was second in charge of a public relations company in Sydney. And I said to my wife, you know I want to write a book. She says, you don't talk about anything else. I said, I think what I need is the time to write a book. So I've got a plan. How about I quit my job and you support us for the next 6 months and pay the mortgage? To my utter shock and amazement, she said yes. I thought I'd give myself 6 months. I think I was still young enough and full enough of myself to think that if I failed, I'd be able to get another job. So I went to work to tell my boss, who's a mate of mine, and my workmates that I was going to quit my job to write a novel. They were all very supportive. One of them said to me, you're an idiot. He says, no one is stupid enough to leave a good job like this in these economic times to go and try to write a book. You're mad. Another mate of mine said to me, you'll never get published. No, mate, he says, this is Australia. Nobody gets published in this country. He said, my uncle wrote a book and it was great. He couldn't get a publisher, so there's no way you're going to get a publisher. Another mate of mine said to me, there's no money in it, you know. Well, he was right. Another friend of mine, Bob, sits me down and says to me, Tony, there is a book in all of us, and that is where most of them should stay. But I was determined to prove them all wrong. So I left work on a Friday, and on a Monday, I sat down at my quiet little writer's retreat, the spare bedroom of our 2-bedroom flat in Artarmon in Sydney, on the edge of the 6-lane Pacific Highway, across the road from the waste transfer station in the industrial estate, to write the great Australian novel. I was not unprepared. I had read a couple of books about how to write a book, and they both said pretty much the same thing. Okay? First of all, you need a plot. If you ask my wife, she said I lost that a long time ago. Anyway, but she said you have to know the beginning, and the middle, and the end of your book before you start writing. It's like the blueprint to your story. Then you need a chapter breakdown. You need to know the detail of what's going to happen all throughout this story. And you need characters, of course. Who are the people that are going to populate this little production that we're putting together? And you need to know a fair bit about these characters before you start writing. You need to know what gender they are, what colour hair they have, what colour eyes they have, what their backstory is, their personal history, what has made them the people that they are when we first come across them on the pages of our novel. Well, this is a lot of work before you even start making up a story. You know, you've got to know everything before you start writing. But that's what the textbook said you had to do. I read 2 of them. I was all right, so I've got to get to work. Well, the first day of my new career, my wife came home from work that afternoon and she was quite excited and she said, "How did you go?" And I looked at the screen in front of me on the computer and there was nothing. Slow start, that's okay, we can catch up with that. The problem was, by the end of the first week, there was still nothing. This thing that I had wanted to do, this dream I had that I had wanted to follow, was proving to be a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. How could I think up an entire story out of nowhere, people out of thin air, and put them all together, assemble them in the way that it's supposed to be assembled? It was proving very difficult. But I had to get cracking because I had a 6-month deadline that I'd set myself. So I did. I started working on this story. I thought, I will write a book that people will want to read. And that was a mistake, right? I started making a number of mistakes. What I should have been doing is thinking about writing about something that I was really passionate in. But no, I thought, I want this book to be published not only in Australia, I want it to be published in America and the UK and Europe. What do people overseas want to read from an Australian author? Where would I set my books? Remember, I had a hard time deciding the place where I was going to set it. I thought, I know, I'll set my book in the outback, like Crocodile Dundee or the Thornbirds or something like that, because that's what people overseas will want to read. There was one tiny problem. I'd never been to the outback. And I thought I'd pretty well failed. But then I started to think, oh, maybe I've just become one of these tortured artistes or racked with self-doubt and self-loathing. I thought I need a second opinion. Maybe it's not that bad. Who am I going to show it to? I couldn't show it to my wife. I was too embarrassed. She'd been slaving away supporting us through what was quite a tough time. And I was too embarrassed to show it to her. I thought, I'll show it to my mum. She got me started on this venture. She encouraged my love of reading, and she's my mum. You know, she'll have something nice to say. So I sent it off to her, and she reads everything, my mum. Fiction, non-fiction, book a day, voracious reader. So she comes back to me very quickly. She's read it. So I said to her, "What do you think?" She goes, "Yes." "Very nice, dear." And if the best your mum can come up with is very nice to you, you know it's a stinker. And it was. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? I have failed at following my dream. I thought I could try and rewrite it, but what would I do differently? I have followed all of the steps to the letter about how you write a book, and it hasn't worked. I thought I could write something else, completely different. But what would I do different? I would do all the same things again. So you know what I did? Nothing. I went back to work on a full-time contract basis with my tail between my legs, to the self-satisfied smirks of all of my mates who said, "I told you so." But something else happened around about that time. In 1995, my wife Nicola came to me and said, "We're going to Africa." And I said, "Okay." Because I had never had any grand dreams to go to Africa. We had married quite young, we don't have kids, and we'd sort of travelled around Asia. We'd backpacked around Asia a bit. We'd lived in the UK, we'd travelled around Europe. And Africa wasn't on my radar at all. She wanted to go see some animals. So I said, okay, that's fine. So I don't know about yourselves, but I know in my relationship and other relationships I've observed over the years, sometimes a little bit of a pattern emerges. You can have one partner who is very organised, They're the ones that quite often have the passwords to the bank accounts and pay the bills. And when it comes to holidays, they're the ones that do a lot of the research. In those days, it was pre-internet, so it was the Lonely Planet guidebook. And she got her Lonely Planet guidebook to Africa out and started researching and looking at places we could go and places we could stay. These organisers, they're very fond of something called Excel. I don't really know what that is, but she would sort of type everything into this software program. We're going to be here on this day and here on that day, and this is where we're going to stay, and this is how we're going to get around. And then there's another member in the relationship who kind of does what they're told. I'll leave it to you to decide which one I am. To give you an indication, I remember being in a cab on the way to Sydney Airport to fly off on this grand adventure and saying to my wife, "Tell me again where we're going." She says, "South Africa, Zimbabwe and Botswana." Has anyone here ever been to some of these countries? I know some people have lived there. So I thought South Africa, that's the one down the bottom, right? Okay. The other two, I wasn't quite sure of where they were, but I thought I'd better start paying attention now, because here we are, we're on our way. And I had a recollection that she had been talking to somebody about a rental car and faxing bits of paper because it was the old days, in the middle of the night, because I gathered there was a time difference, and there's about an 8-hour time difference, about rental cars, which is really interesting because she doesn't drive. So I said to her, "Am I under the impression that I will be driving for part of this grand adventure around Africa, through these big game parks with all these dangerous animals and all these dodgy cities and towns everywhere?" And she said, "No." I said, "Whoa, that's a relief." She says, "You'll be driving the whole time." I said, "Hang on a minute." I said, "Can't we get the train?" She says, "No, I don't think we can get the train around." I said, "That's okay." So I'm going to be driving. So now I thought I really need to start paying attention now. So I said, "Okay, what sort of vehicle are we getting?" Because I'm picturing a 4x4, right? Something big, macho, bull bar, maybe zebra stripes on the side, maybe a pop-up roof like in Daktari. I was going to be carried away. She says, "A Corolla?" Now at this point, as the follower, you're not allowed to say to the planner, "You sure you know what you're doing?" She says, "It'll be fine." "Oh, okay, all very well, easy for you to say." So we landed at Johannesburg Airport, which if I had any preconceptions or thought about it, I probably pictured a tin shed in the middle of the bush with a few zebras wandering around outside. But of course, it was a big flash airport in a big bustling metropolis, a big city. And there was our Corolla waiting for us. So we got in there, and I think what happened to me is directly related to this series of events. The fact that I had spent no time thinking about what was about to happen to me. And I wasn't averse to the idea of going to Africa, don't get me wrong, going to South Africa, Zimbabwe and Botswana. I thought it'd be great. But I had no preconceptions at all, no ideas, no thoughts about it. And it all happened very, very quickly. We flew via Singapore, so we arrived very early in the morning, jet lagged to the max. Might have had a couple of beers on the plane as well too. Anyway, so I'm in this car and I leave the airport and you go onto this road, the R21, then the N11 and then the N4. And all of a sudden I'm moving faster than I ever have in my entire life. I'm driving at 120 because there's these signs on the side of the road that say 120 in a red circle, just like ours. But what I didn't realise, as far as the local population was concerned, was that was the minimum. So because I'm going along at 120 and everyone's zooming past me at 140, 150, I thought, this is crazy. What have I got myself in for? And a very few short hours later, we rolled through the gates of a place called the Kruger National Park. I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's South Africa's flagship game reserve, biggest national park. And everything started happening to me very, very quickly. The most amazing series of experiences that I had no preparation for. I'm driving down a road through the national park, come around a bend, and there's a big, fully grown male elephant. He's got his ears out, his trunk up, and he's coming down the street trumpeting at me. And what I have subsequently learned over the last 27 years is a mock charge, but feels like anything but if you're trying to find reverse for the first time in a rental car and fiddle with some little anti-hijacking immobiliser device. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. First time I saw a lion, we were driving down the road and this big, fully grown male lion comes walking down the road. Now we'd started talking to some locals. They said, "Leave your windows open, enjoy the sounds and the smells of Africa." So I'm sitting there in my little car, and let me tell you, when a fully grown lion walks within arm's reach next to your Corolla, you're not looking down at it, you're looking up on it. It was so unpredictable. I'd been used to holidays where, you know, if it's Tuesday, this must be Belgium, you know, or we're going to see the cathedral tomorrow and then we're going to the museum. And I love all that stuff. Don't get me wrong. I love architecture and history. But here we had no idea what was going to happen from day to day, from minute to minute. And it was crazy. And I don't know whether we were bitten by something or we drank something or we breathed something in or whatever. But this place, this continent, with the different countries that we travelled through and the different cultures that we started encountering, and the people we started meeting, each of whom had the most amazing story. There's like a Crocodile Dundee on every street corner in that place. I tell you, I thought this is incredible. It started to take hold. This continent reached out and wrapped its thorny tendrils around our hearts and sucked us in. And by the end of that first trip, we had pretty well planned our next trip back the following year. And we did. We went back. We were both back to work full time. I was doing contracting work. We came back the following year on another holiday for a couple of weeks, came back the year after, going back to some of the same places we've been to and some of the different places we've been to. And in 1998, which was coming up for our third or fourth trip back to Africa, my wife took redundancy from the company she was working for, and very amicably, and had a bit of money. She said, "You've had your midlife crisis, trying to write a book." She says, "I'm going to have mine now," bit of an early midlife. "Let's go for 4 months." I said, "Great." I was well up for that. So instead of renting a car, we bought a vehicle, bought an old Land Rover, an old Series 3 Land Rover, filled it full of second-hand camping gear to do it on the cheap, and we thought we're going to set out for a big adventure. Just drive around Africa, southern Africa for 4 months. We'll go to South Africa, back to Zimbabwe, maybe back to Botswana, go to some places we haven't been to, like Zambia, and just make it up as we go along. Even my wife, the arch planner, was content to say, let's not have a plan. Let's just pack up. Tomorrow we go wherever we feel like going. Do the nomad thing. I thought, that sounds pretty good to me. So we started off back where it all began, back in the Kruger National Park. I was in a campsite, had the tent up, and I took out a laptop computer. I just bought my first laptop computer I'd ever owned. And I brought it with me, not to write a novel, but because I thought I was doing freelance writing on the side. I thought maybe I'd write a few travel stories and maybe earn a bit of brass while we're travelling. So I got the computer out, and it suddenly struck me that here I was with two things on my hand that had eluded me when I'd been trying to write a book. I had time, again, only 4 months, but 4 months stretching out ahead of me where I had pretty well not much to do except drive around Africa, looking at animals and having a good time. I thought, I've got enough time to write a book again. And most importantly, there was a place. And it was a case of me probably not being able to see the forest for the trees, because here was this continent about to unroll itself again in front of me over the space of these next few months. A place that I had been to before. And when I say place, I mean several places, several countries, several different parts of the continent. I could write a book set in Africa on this tour that we're on. And I had a bit of a think about what I'd done wrong when I wrote that first book. I think what I did wrong is I followed the rules. Remember, I'd read those books that said you had to have a plot, the beginning, the middle and the end. And I thought to myself, why? I would no sooner want to know the middle and the end of a book that I was going to write any more than I would want to know the middle and the end of a book that I was going to read. I thought, where's the fun in that? Because that first endeavour was not fun. Like I said, it was boring. I knew how the story was going to end before I started writing it. Why can't I just make it up as I go along? And as for characters, I've met a couple of people here. I know a couple of people here. I think I know you, but maybe I don't know everything about you, because that's real life. It takes time to get to know someone, the real person. Why should I have to make up a character and know everything about them before I even start writing their story? Can't I just introduce a character while I'm writing, and then as we go along on our journey, literally, I can get to know those characters. They might be a good person. They might be a bad person. They might be a bad person pretending to be a good person. I don't know, because I haven't really decided yet. And that's what I started to do. I started to write a book set on a tour around Africa. We were just the two of us, but I set it on a group tour, a bunch of backpackers on a truck travelling around Africa. And each day as we packed up camp and moved to somewhere else, so too did the action in that story move. And I worked in those locations where we were into the story. And because I like thrillers with a little bit of action and adventure and maybe a bit of crime and corruption, if I didn't know what to put in my story, all I had to do was switch on the radio or pick up a newspaper in the countries I was travelling through, and I would get more than a dozen crazy ideas for plot twists and action and things to happen in my book that I would be hard-pressed putting in a novel because no one would believe it outside of South Africa or Zimbabwe. But it was all there. And if I got stuck, well, it was very hard to get stuck. I'm not the sort of writer who can claim writer's block, because if I didn't know what to write, I would just look around me. And if a herd of elephants walked past the fence, I would type, and then a herd of elephants walked past the fence. It was quite easy in some ways. And by the end of that 4 months, I had a book finished, set on this tour. And you know what? I'd enjoyed it. I had enjoyed just making up the story literally every day. I didn't know what was going to happen to these people from one day to the next. And because I was writing a thriller, I thought, good, if I don't know what's going to happen, then nor will the reader. And it'll be a big surprise to them when it happens. But now I thought maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic. The old self-doubt started to creep in. I thought I need somebody else to read this story of mine. I wasn't going to show my mum, but I was quite happy to show it to my wife. We were in Botswana, and I went to a print shop and I printed it out. And I said, I'll get her to read it. There's one little problem. When we first went on holidays many years before this, the first time I saw her read a book, I was quite surprised because she has a very interesting way of reading a book. When she gets a new book, she picks it up, she reads the first few pages, the first chapter, and then she goes to the end. Does anybody here read books like that? There's always one. And Wendy, it's you, always. Shame on you. I said to her, what are you doing? What are you doing? She said, well, if I get a new book, it's like a movie. As soon as it starts, I know how it's going to finish. I said, oh, really? Do you? Okay. She says, I said, so then you read the end. Yes, I read the end. I said, why do you read the end? She says, to prove I was right. And I said, well, just out of interest, were you right? She says, I'm always right. I said, so let me get this straight. You read the beginning and you read the end. What do you do then? She said, well, if I like the beginning and the end, then I read the middle. I said, well, you're not going to read my book like that. No way. So as I said, I printed it out. So what I did is I just started feeding her a few pages at a time. Oh my goodness, she hated that. She hated that. Give me more. No. So she starts reading and she says, I know what's going to happen next. This is going to happen next. And you know what? She was right. I said, how can that be? I've made this story up from one day to the next. I didn't know what was going to happen next. She says, I know you. She says, you're not a very good liar. She says, you're hopeless. You telegraph your punches all the time. You know, I can see what's going to happen. I said, okay. I thought I can maybe fix that. If I edit this thing, I can make it a little bit less obvious. Because I read it and I thought, well, maybe I did have an inkling of what was going to happen. I don't know. But what kept me going was every now and then is she'd read a couple of pages and she'd say, I know what's going to happen next. This is going to happen next. And she was wrong. And that made me feel so good. Because I worked out then that my aim in life as a writer would be to fool my wife. Keep her guessing. We got to the end of that process. I fixed the book up, and to cut a very long story short, I sent it to a publisher in Australia, Pam McMillan. First publisher I sent it to, I got published. And my publisher said, we were looking for a thriller set in Africa, and you can write the African books. And here I am 20 years later still writing the African books. This is my 20th novel. Just like that first one and like all the others, this is a book that's very much written on location. It's about things that were happening in Southern Africa when I was there, whenever I wrote it, last year I think it was. And the book meanders. It meanders from Cape Town up through Botswana into Zimbabwe because that's where I was at the time. And so where I happened to be, I worked in some of those locations. And if you've travelled around Southern Africa, you might recognise some of those fairly prominent locations. The subject matter, if you haven't read my books, one thing in common with all of them is I do tend to look at, they're thrillers, but I do like to base them on real life issues. Sometimes crime related, and a recurring theme is the illegal trade in endangered species and wildlife. Not just wildlife, but anything from the natural environment that's worth a quid or two is going to be stolen and subjected to crime. I had a book that came out during COVID called Last Survivor, which is about the plants that I'm looking at just outside the library, cycads. There's a thriving illegal trade in cycads around the world worth millions of dollars, which touches this part of the world, it touches Australia, as well as South Africa in a big way. This pillaging of the environment for money is a big problem. whether it's rhinos being killed for their horns, whether it's elephants being killed for their ivory, pangolins being killed for their scales. I did another book about vultures that are killed for use in traditional medicine. It's terrible. And over the years, I had a few readers, particularly from South Africa, say to me, why don't you have a look at abalone? I'd never eaten abalone. I didn't know anything about it. Abalone, they call it over there. I always get mixed up as to how to pronounce it. But I knew there was a trade in abalone, as there is here, an illegal trade as well as a legal trade. And I thought, really? Okay, so I'll have a look at it. So the more I started looking into it, which is the premise certainly for the start of this book, the more alarmed I became. South Africa, like Australia, is or was rich in the stock of this shellfish, which is increasingly highly prized as a delicacy in parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and particularly in Hong Kong as it happens. And there is a thriving market in this stuff. Now in South Africa, like Australia, there's a legal market. It can be legally harvested to a certain degree, but that doesn't satisfy the demand. Now here's the thing. It's estimated that the illegal trade in abalone out of southern Africa is 35 times the size of the legal trade, worth billions of dollars. And this is crime on an industrial and organised scale, because when it gets that big, the big players get involved. There's a problem in South Africa, particularly in the Cape area, with drugs. And the drug of choice there is methamphetamine, what we would know as ice, but what's locally known as a derivative is called tick. And it's a big problem there. And that trade in drugs is run by gangs, quite violent gangs in the Cape area, around Cape Town. Now the abalone trade has been taken over by the triads, by Asian organised crime gangs. And they have done a deal now where the abalone is paid for using the raw materials to make this drug tick. So we have two highly organised, resourced, sometimes quite violent organised crime gangs that are involved in the shellfish trade, with drugs coming in from Asia and abalone going out of South Africa. It's a high stakes, high value business that people will jealously guard and will go to any means to guard. Now the interesting thing I then learned, which is why the book meanders a little bit, is that the largest exporter of abalone from Africa is a country called Zimbabwe, which is really interesting because, as you may know, it's a landlocked country. So what happens is a lot of the illegal abalone is trucked, is smuggled, often through Botswana, up into Zimbabwe, where it's then flown out legally to Asia. And some of it's trucked to Mozambique. And so we have this now multinational cross-border illegal trade. Who better to disrupt this trade than one of my favourite recurring characters, Sonia Kurtz, who's a supposedly retired mercenary. I don't think she has much time for a break. If you haven't come across Sonia in my books before, the best way I can describe her is a single mum with relationship issues and an AK-47. So she and her daughter Emma, who's getting on a little bit now, join together and they run foul of one of these gangs. And Sonia becomes the hunted instead of the hunter. So that's basically what happens in that book. I think to wrap up, I'd just like to say that my books do focus on the underbelly of things in Africa. They do look at crime and corruption. They look at the illegal trade in wildlife. And some of it's pretty horrendous, you know. I've touched on other problems that the continent faces, health issues such as HIV/AIDS, malaria that kills millions of people per year. The risk I run is that I don't want to turn people off from visiting Southern Africa because I love it to bits, and I choose to live half of my life there because, as I said, since those books have come out, my wife and I have literally lived half our lives there. So on one hand, I'm confronted by and have to write about the problems the continent faces. But if I find myself starting to be dragged down by some of these issues, I stop and I think about the other side of the equation. Because if there's one thing that struck me in my travels around Africa in 27 years that's greater than the scale of hardship and problems that people face on a day-to-day basis, it is that unquantifiable yet very real thing called the indomitable human spirit. The ability of good people to come together more often than not at the grassroots level or the community level or the volunteer level to try and change things. And often it has to be from the ground up because the governments that are in charge of some of these places are not equipped or inclined to address some of these problems. But it doesn't stop good people from going out of their way to do the right thing. I've often said that if you're like environmentally conscious, if you want to call yourself a greenie, as sort of I do here, I've become probably more aware of and more interested in the environment and the state of our planet since I started travelling in Africa. That in Australia we advocate, you know, we lobby, we contact our members of parliament, we try and look for ways legislation can be changed or enforced to get change happen from the top down. More often than not in parts of Africa that's not possible because the people that should be making the regulations, as I said, are not inclined to, or they're corrupt or they're disorganised or whatever. But to be a greenie in a country like South Africa or Zimbabwe, to be concerned and want to do something about conserving an endangered species can mean putting on a uniform and picking up a gun and going into the bush and putting your life on the line. I've just done a book in South Africa about the rhino war, about the fight to protect the rhinos. And there's one particularly poignant scene in that book which I wrote with a retired South African general who was brought in to run the fight against poaching, in which his rangers in the Kruger National Park are starting to show the symptoms that soldiers do after prolonged exposure to combat and death, post-traumatic stress disorder. We have rangers, males and females, who've been in countless gunfights, who've seen so many dead animals, have seen people killed and people injured. And the National Park has a resident psychologist brought in by the general who is running the operation. And the psychologist says to him that she is concerned about 2 female rangers, not because they're female, but because they've been exposed to prolonged action, been in serious life-threatening situations, seen people and animals killed. She says, "General, we need to give these 2 ladies a rest." And he goes to them and gives them the news. "We're going to have to take you out of the line, give you a rest." And these 2 African female rangers say, "No, General, we're staying." When I was researching the trade in abalone, I also heard the story of a fisheries inspector who was involved in a bust of an abalone heist. And that degenerated into a gunfight with the gangsters that were there. And this fisheries inspector was shot and a bullet severed his spine. He was left paralysed. Now, you would think the government and his department and whatever would step up and come to the fore, but it wasn't enough. But the small coastal town that he lived in was so moved by the fact that he had literally put his life on the line to protect abalone, came together and raised enough money to buy him a state-of-the-art wheelchair, to modify his house, and to come up with enough money to support his family. There's one other thing you need to write a book. You need time and place, but the other thing you need is inspiration. The inspiration to me is a word that has 2 distinct meanings. On one level it means stuff, ideas for a story. Like I said, I've got no shortage of ideas for a story. I can write a book a year until I die easily, said in Africa. But inspiration also means to be inspired, to be uplifted. And if you haven't read any of my books, I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm a bit of a sucker for a happy ending. I always tell my South African readers when I'm travelling in South Africa that I'm the definition of an optimist. I'm an Australian who bought 2 houses in South Africa. So I like to be uplifted, and when I find myself perhaps getting a little bit down about the state of the environment or the disappearing abalone or vultures or rhinos or elephants, I stop and I think about those men and women that go into action, that refuse to be withdrawn from the line of duty because they want to protect an animal, or a bloke who will literally put his life on the line to protect shellfish. And I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty inspirational. Thank you for listening to me.